Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to History with the Bard. I'm your host, Creepy Bard, and today we're going to talk about one of the oldest and most important topics in history. Is history fiction, and why should we care? There are a lot of reasons why this is an important conversation to have, even though we can't hope to do it justice in the time we're going to dedicate to it here. But the reasons we're going to talk about it today are twofold. First, this works as a sort of historiography, or like a philosophy by which to view history, and it will make understanding the way that I view history and why I portray it the way I do that much easier. The second reason we'll be going over this topic is to stress that this discussion is by no means solved, and quite possibly never will be, unless we somehow invent time travel. If this specific topic interests you, and you'd like to dig further, I recommend checking out Anne Curthoy and John Docker's Is History Fiction? We're going to reference a bit of their work in the background section of this video, and while I disagree with their conclusion, it's still some impressive work. To properly discuss whether or not history is fiction, we first need to go into some history about history. That's problematic. Anyway, the beginning of this conversation starts pretty much at the beginning of history as a field of study. You see, there were two men, Herodotus and Thucydides, and both of these Greek men would begin codifying what is and is not history during their lifespans. Their beliefs in general weren't terribly important, but the way each of them looked at the concept of history has shaped the way that we have viewed history ever since. You see, Thucydides believed that only the information that could be 100% corroborated, and even then, only information about the great men of the ages, was relevant to be recorded. He felt that things weren't history if you could not prove, without doubt, that the information you were portraying was not completely true. Meanwhile, Herodotus viewed history from the perspective of a storyteller. If you needed to make something up to make the narrative flow better, then as long as it wasn't too ridiculous, then by all means, go ahead. Obviously, this is a bit of an abridged version of what they believed, and if you've done any studying into this, you'll know that it goes much deeper than all that. But this gives us a basis we need to understand the debate. I feel we should also take a quick moment to clarify something that isn't quite apparent to people outside of academics. History refers to two things. First, and most commonly, it refers to the stories and common ideas that people have about history. World War II is history, for example. However, history also refers to the act of studying and analyzing those stories, and then writing something that can tell someone else your conclusion. The act of making these videos is me doing history. This is an important thing to note, because the debate usually involves this distinction pretty heavily. To decide whether history is fiction or not, you have to decide whether you believe everything that we think we understand. If you're a person skilled in pattern recognition, then the answer is really clear. Yes, history is most certainly fiction, but being fiction doesn't matter. Whether or not history is fiction, the act of unraveling and examining our past is an important aspect of who we are, both as individuals and as a society. We're never going to have the entire picture for any aspect of history we look at, and new information may come out that tells us that what we believed for the longest time is actually completely false. After all, just look at the dinosaurs. For the longest time, we thought dinosaurs were giant reptilian dragon monsters, but new research and information has told us that they're actually much closer to birds, to the point where they could have even been covered in feathers. History is not immutable, and it is the very act of doing history that makes it fluid. Everyone inserts a bit of themselves into history, both as they view it and as they do it, so examining and re-examining that history is important. Naturally, historians care a great deal about this distinction, but let's face it, historians care about every distinction, and it can get a little bit silly. I've met a decent handful of academics already who will froth and rage and fight over things that most people would consider completely inane, like whether or not we should call the Dark Ages the Dark Ages. Outside of the people most invested in the question, who even cares? That really depends on who you ask. For some people, the fact that history could be fiction at all is completely ludicrous, blasphemy of the highest order. And there are others who are totally okay with the idea that history is fiction, because then they get to use that as a justification to completely ignore it. Both of these views miss the point. It doesn't matter if history is fiction or not, because even if it is fiction, the act of doing history is itself important. When we study history, we aren't just studying the events of what happened, we're studying so much more. We're studying human beings on every level. We're studying people who lived during those times, the biases of the person who documented it, the biases of ourselves as readers, and the biases that have become systemic in our culture. And the more we study and refine history, the more we can take control of those biases instead of them taking control of us. Hey everyone, thanks so much for checking out our video and listening to me give my opinion. Let us know what you think about this topic in the comments below, and give us some suggestions for other parts of history that might interest you. We just might use them in a later video. If you enjoyed this video and want to see us make similar content, feel free to support us on Patreon. If you're new to the channel, you can always go back and check out some of our older videos. They can be a bit of a slog, but we cover some interesting topics. As always, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we hope you'll join us next week for our game design video about interactive difficulty.